All right, I want to move on to the next topic. And again, I don't know
Yeah.
how long we'll spend on this one, but this is there. A few weeks ago, there were rumors that the spec sheet for the PlayStation 5 had been leaked. Now, I'm pretty sure those rumors have been put to bed because for one reason or another, I don't know if it's Sony just denied it or I think I remember watching a YouTube video where, because a lot of times when they get into specs and stuff, they use words that I don't quite understand. They're the kind of things that Ned would be like, oh yeah, I know what a gigaflop means and stuff like that. I don't necessarily know what any of that means. So I remember watching a YouTube video where they said like the only way in the world that if this spec sheet could be correct is if the PlayStation 5 was going to cost $900 or something ridiculous like that.
Wouldn't surprise me.
So that was put to bed. But the question that I want to ask my panel here is, the Switch is just barely a year old. The Xbox One X is not even a year old. The PlayStation 4 Pro is just barely older than the Switch. Are we ready to be talking about PlayStation 5 and whatever random number that Microsoft decides to tack onto the back of whatever the next Xbox is? Like, is this a thing that we're ready for? Do we want it? Do we care?
Nope.
Well, there you go, Assad. All right, good night, everybody.
No, I mean, it just seems like it's like too much too soon.
Well, we know it's coming.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, obviously they're working on it. They started working on the PS5 the day that they finalized the specs for the PS4. I mean, that's just the thing.
Yeah.
Well, what I'm saying is we had the new editions of the Xbox One and the PS4 Pro or whatever, which means they're trying to get rid of certain amounts of backstock of things. So they had to throw some stuff together before they could clear out their warehouses and have the new stuff put together. As soon as they announced Scorpio or whatever, we knew the next one was coming up, the Xbox One S. I mean, hell, man, I bought one. I think I've turned it on 3 times since Black Friday last year.
Yeah.
And twice was for Netflix.
Yeah.
So Ned, you're primarily a PC guy. I'm interested to hear your perspective, if you even have one, as long as that perspective is not my master race.
We don't use that phrase here.
So
I fire people who use that phrase.
I was mocking it. So go ahead.
You're fired. Mocking.
Donald Trump is now on the podcast.
So I think what we're going to continue to see from the hardware manufacturers for the next few years, you'll notice something very different about this generation of consoles compared to the previous ones. It started last generation with the iterations of the Xbox 360, where you had the original 360, then you had the 360S, and then you had the 360E. And you sort of had the same thing with the PS3 and the PS3 Slim and the PS3 Super Slim. But what I think we're going to see from this point forward from a hardware perspective, and it's what makes sense as a manufacturer, is rather than seeing drastic upgrades where you had the huge jump from the PS1 to the PS2 and the PS2 to the PS3, you'll notice we didn't have as huge a one from the PS3 to the PS4. And you're having these small incremental changes to the hardware for the PS4 to the PS4 Pro, for the Xbox One to the One S to the X, that introduce new features. I don't think necessarily... I think it's representative and reflective of what's happening in the PC space as well. For example, at this point in time, we would have already seen a successor to Windows 10 if Microsoft was operating the way it had in the past, but we aren't, because we're seeing the development of Windows as a service rather than as a simple operating system.
Right.
And I think what we're seeing now is we're starting to see the beginning of games as a service. You know, with the incremental upgrades to the hardware, what we're going to see over time is as games become more of a service and as games become more digital, which they're largely digital now, but as it becomes more integrated, where we see the legacy physical copies slowly go away over time. They're going to be here for at least another 10 years, but most people are moving toward digital copies. And as we see gaming become more games as a service, I think we're going to see less of huge generational changes, except when, marketing needs to push that, and more of these consoles and games as a service.
Right.
Okay. So based on what you're saying right there, I have a theory, right?
Mhm.
Okay. Now we have bundled services, web, internet, telephone, and TV, right? So what happens if later on down the road, say, Charter decides to add a fourth, thing to their triple play? You rent an Xbox from Charter, and with that rental includes the Game Pass that Microsoft does or whatever, but it also doubles as a TV receiver or internet modem or something like that. We could do that. I think that would work.
So interesting that you mentioned that. They didn't advertise it very much, but kind of the middle of the Xbox 360's life cycle, you could go sign a contract, 2 years of Xbox Live Gold. You were paying $15 a month for it, which was significantly more expensive than just going and paying the 50 or $60 a year that it was. But you got an Xbox 360. I don't think it was like free. I think it was like you paid them $100 for the 360,
subsidized like Verizon,
right? Like your cell phone would be. And also for a little while, and I think there were only 2 cable service providers that offered it, but you could use your 360 as your cable box for, I think it was Uverse and Fios, which Fios is in a very small part of the country. Uverse is a little bit more out there than Fios is, but so this actually already has precedent. This has happened sort of before. I don't think you could buy your Xbox 360 through AT&T with the cable service. You had to supply your own, but the foundation is there.
Okay, so let's assume that that's not what's going to happen next. Let's assume that instead, I think that if it doesn't become a rental or a lease subsidized box type deal, I think you're more likely to see a standard box that is modular, and you switch out, say, a corner of it, like where in the 360 where you had to insert the hard drive. Yeah. Let's say you pull out a small section that turns out to be 20% of the back of the machine, and you replace it with the next higher up GPU, or you pull out the top of it, and all of a sudden, hey, now you got a new CPU or new power core, more RAM, whatever. And you're not going to see new systems. You're going to see incremental increases to the system. And Ned says games as a service. I think it's more of a modular thing where you have your base model and then you pay for additional stuff as needed. Like you say you buy your HP or you get your HP for free, but then you have to pay for all the drivers. Mm-hmm. So that sort of deal.
So then basically you have a PC.
Freemium. A freemium console.
There you go.
There was a story by Cory Doctorow called Little Brother, where in that story Microsoft did exactly that. They released in the story they released what he called the Xbox Universal, which was a completely free console that was given out. And it was, of course, this illustrates the problem with the story. Microsoft made it completely open source.
Yeah. Never happened.
But they gave out this free console called the Xbox Universal if you were willing to opt into their game service.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now they may not make things open source, but they do certainly make it very, very easy to get into the development spaces.
Yeah.
Fair.
So, I mean, they're about as close to open source as they're going to get when it comes to that. I mean, I still can't go in and say, hey, can I have all the Apple APIs for iOS or, things of that nature.
Mm-hmm. So. So as I mean, whether it's too soon to be talking about this or not, we're inevitably going to get to where there is a PlayStation 5, where there's I'm just going to call it Xbox 2 because I don't have a better name for it, where there is whatever comes after the Switch.
The Swatch.
Dude, yes, it's a watch that has Joy-Con on the I have my response to this already, because I would disagree that this is, but there's the question of, is just more horsepower enough to justify new hardware? And like Ned even said, the jump you can go back to, so the jump from Atari to NES was pretty significant. The jump from NES to Super NES was significant, to the point where Miyamoto had the idea for Yoshi for Super Mario Brothers 3, and the NES couldn't do it. So Yoshi didn't appear in a Mario game until the Super Nintendo.
Yoshi would have been weird in Mario 3 anyway.
Would have been weird. Then you got from the Super Nintendo to the N64 is obviously a big jump. Then the N64 to the GameCube was a big jump. And it was actually at that time that the then president of Nintendo, Hiroshi Yamauchi, said that Nintendo wasn't going to focus on graphics anymore because it didn't matter. Now, I think he was way early on that, because then we had HD, and that was a big jump. But so from GameCube to, we'll say, Xbox 360, because obviously it was not a graphical jump, was really big. But the jump from Xbox 360 to Xbox One, I mean, graphically we've gotten better, but the increase in like the number of polygons and stuff that we can display on screen, and the resolution and all that stuff, hasn't really turned into experiences that you can only have on the next generation hardware. Now, if we want to talk about VR, that's a completely different thing. But I like my favorite example of this is Dead Rising for the Xbox 360. You could have 800 independently controlled by the computer zombies. Now, I realize they're zombies. It's not like they're doing anything smart, but there's 800 unique enemies plus your main character and a couple of AI humans that you're trying to save, all on screen at the same time. That would not have been possible on the original Xbox. But from what I can tell, in my experience, I haven't played a game for my Xbox One or back when I had my PS4 that would not have worked on the PS3 or the Xbox 360 just at a lower resolution. I haven't played that game. So is just making the games prettier enough to justify new hardware, or do we need something else? Like, and I'm just gonna, whether you like it or not, I'm gonna use the Switch because it's the one thing that's different. That is I'm not getting a new gameplay experience out of the Switch. It's what I'm getting is I'm able to experience the game by being able to leave my house with it. And for me, that's a pretty big thing. But I mean, sure, it's not as big of a difference as, say, the Wii was, but they are differentiating themselves. So the question I'm trying to ask is more horsepower is enough? Do we care?
Okay, well, there's a couple of points, a couple of salient points I think that you need to touch on. First of all, the most popular games in the world right now are not even console games; they're mobile games. Mm-hmm. Okay, and I can tell you that most of the modern consoles beat the smeg out of most handheld devices.
Yes.
Number two, I know you have to remember back on our conversation in Join the Rivalry like a year and a half ago or whatever, where you and me and Vince were talking about the Switch when it was coming up, and it hadn't even been released yet. And I was saying I probably will never buy it, blah, 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 because Nintendo sucks and fanboys are dookies. But having purchased it, I think Switch probably hit that sweet spot. Because it's powerful enough to run some of the last gen games. Mm-hmm. It's never gonna pull down some of the newer stuff. I don't think you'll see it running Elder Scrolls 6. But for Skyrim, it's pretty decent. For Doom, it's okay. Ultimately, Switch right now to me feels like a handheld Steam library, but that it's populated as the Steam libraries are with 99% indie games that aren't very good. But when you've got more on-the-go stuff, I think ultimately... Do any of you remember about 2 years ago when mock-ups of the Xbox Mobile were shown on the internet where people were saying...
Yeah.
That was always something I thought should happen. Mm-hmm. And I guess this shows my personal platform bias in current generations, and that I think that was a good idea, but Switch was dumb. I still think some things about Switch are dumb, but mobile gaming is probably more important than your VR capacity, than your overall game capacity. Graphics are at that point where, well, you're just looking for FPS now.
Yeah.
And most people don't have TVs that have a high enough refresh rate for that to matter. Most people don't have those 4K UHD TVs. Most people don't have the money to pick up your 8K TVs. And at this point, it's just getting gratuitous. And how many companies do you know that are going to not have to have millions and millions and millions of capital in advance to build these games, to run on 4K HD, to run on VR? It's your sweet spot is right around your Xbox One, graphic wise, and that's about it.
Yeah,
that's my opinion.
I feel like at least for the PC market, it is important that the next generation, whatever it may be, really push their performance up because of ports. If the ports are coming from, which sadly more recently being the past, I don't know, 15 years or so, where the ports were coming from the console, like the game was made for console and then moved to PC, if that. And so the ports were either garbage because the console isn't the same architecture, or because the people didn't care enough to try to port it over and do it well enough for the PC players. Call of Duty is probably one of the bigger examples. The Treyarch developers, I believe, were the only ones that actually cared more about their PC ports than Infinity Ward, sorry. But at the same time, if you look at exclusives, I feel like it's not really necessary. If you're strictly talking about the next generation of consoles, more power isn't really necessary. Like you were saying, it's really hasn't been anything you couldn't have experienced on the last generation, but with just lower resolution, crappier graphics. I would say God of War being the most recent example of just like ridiculous amount of that game is beautiful.
Yeah. Oh, no doubt.
But that being said, gameplay wise, yeah, there was a game that probably came out on the 360 and the PS3 that were just as fun, or in the same combat style, in the same trying to think of the word, the same how big it was, how encompassing it was of this giant world building that the God of War series has. Whereas Xbox One, if you look at their exclusives, it's kind of, there are people like Xbox One exclusives, and that's their own fan base. Same with PS4. But PS4 is doing better because they're actually getting exclusives, at least out. Xbox One, Microsoft is not doing so hot. I feel like the only, unless I'm probably forgetting some, but Dead Rising 4 was the one that released with Xbox One, or shortly after.
Dead Rising 3 was the one that came out launch day.
That was 3.
And Dead Rising 4, they brought back Frank West.
Okay.
But it's more recent.
That was slightly disappointing from what I heard. It wasn't the same as the first two, and it wasn't anywhere near as good and stuff like that. But you have Scalebound, looked awesome. That was canceled.
I'd rather have Left 4 Dead 3, honestly.
What's the other game that the first two came out on 360? This new one, it has Terry Crews in it, but it keeps on getting pushed back.
Crackdown.
Oh, Crackdown.
Yeah.
Crackdown 3. I feel like that's probably one of the only exclusives mentioned at the very beginning that still has a chance of coming out that people were excited for.
Right.
I don't know why anybody was excited for it. The only reason why anybody bought the first one was for the freaking beta to get into Halo 3.
Yeah, I got Crackdown free with Games with Gold, the first one, and I played it, and I liked it, but it got very repetitive the longer that I went.
Playing Crackdown 1
old.
was best with friends because you had cheats and stuff. That's one thing I'd
yeah.
like to see return is cheats in video games because those were always fun.
Oh, you don't
Those still
play
exist?
enough. Yeah, they
They
Grand
still
Theft
exist
Auto.
in GTA 5, don't they?
Yeah, I guess
Yeah.
there are games. I don't know. I just feel like they've taken a backseat where it's
Saints
like,
Row.
Yeah.
it's just not like I don't know. I don't see big head mode enough.
Get back on the NBA Jam wagon, man.
Heck yeah.
Oh, NBA Jam. I
So
forgot that was remade.
since we're talking about Xbox exclusives, and I am someone who I grew up a Nintendo kid. The only Sega property that I ever really liked, and it's mostly because it's the only Sega property I had much of an opportunity to play because I didn't grow around the Genesis, was Sonic the Hedgehog. So I grew up liking Sonic, but mostly it was Nintendo. I didn't really get away from Nintendo games, and I didn't really get away from Nintendo games. I just started expanding my horizons. Was when I won my Xbox 360 right when it came out, and so I started playing Halo, and I got into Gears of War and stuff like that. So I continued my upgrade path with Nintendo, but I also continued it with Microsoft, and I got an Xbox One. And one of the reasons I got an Xbox One was because I am a really big Halo fan, and I don't think I'm saying anything controversial when I say that Halo 5 is garbage. Every piece of the, and I know there's people out there that think Halo 5 has the best multiplayer. You're wrong. It's garbage. Stop playing it.
Halo 4 wasn't that good.
Halo 4 wasn't, but it wasn't awful. It
still
just
better than
wasn't great.
I don't know. I was good with how Halo 3 ended. I really was.
Well, and that'll get me on a whole nother tangent where I have the same opinion about Star Wars that I do about Halo. Halo is much bigger than Master Chief.
Right. Disney
And
never
when
should
Halo
have
3
bought Halo.
when no, not that. When Halo 3 ended and Master Chief was presumed dead, he should have stayed that way. ODST, one of the best Halo games. Reach, one of the best Halo games. Neither one of those games have Master Chief as a playable character. They mention him because he exists in this world, but he's not the focus of it. And so when Bungie leaves and 343 picks it up and they do that teaser for Halo 4 and everybody freak, oh, Master Chief's back. I felt like I was the only person that went, no, he's dead. Can we please move on? And how that lines up with my opinion of Star Wars is that's how I feel about the Skywalker family. I don't care about the Skywalkers anymore. Can we please stop making movies about them?
I am excited for Jon Favreau, I think is how you pronounce his last
Favreau.
name. Favreau. The director.
Oh, Favreau's is he doing that? Yeah.
He's doing a Star Wars series.
He makes
Star
good
Wars
movies.
series.
Did you know he directed Elf? Great movie.
You're a horrible person. Okay, guys, it's starting to get kind of late. We really need to.
Yeah. Okay, so
that's
that. All right. So I want to mention we have a merch store. I'm going to have a link for it in the description of the podcast, whether you're watching on YouTube or there. You can buy T-shirts, hoodies, mugs. You can buy mugs with our mug on it. So yeah, check that out. All right.